a lot of those people that we would consider in the frozen middle, they're not trying to do a bad job. They're not trying necessarily to resist change for the sake of resisting change. They're trying to operate within the incentive structures, practice those behaviors that they've been taught to practice.
How does your company handle change? When I work with organizations, one of the biggest differences I see is how they deal with change, or more specifically, how they empower leaders and individuals within the organization to enact change. Our guest today is Rhet Turnbull, a senior solutions architect at Leidos with over 29 years of experience in military operations, engineering, and program management. I first met him as Colonel Turnbull at Space Systems Command and always saw him as one of the most outspoken leaders trying to fix bad processes within the U.S. military. In today's conversation, we focus on some strategies that any leader can use to help remove blockers for their team and improve performance for their organization. You can expect to learn how to use process mapping to identify root problems, why an electronic suggestion box might be a bad idea, and the importance of doing unscalable things. If this is your first time listening to the show, please make sure you subscribe so you never miss a future episode. And if you like the episode today, make sure to share it with someone else so we continue to grow our reach. With that, let's get into the discussion with Rhet Turnbull. So we both graduated from the Air Force Academy. Obviously, the Air Force Academy is a place where you spend a lot of time thinking about leadership. Now that you've kind of done your full circle career from the Air Force, I'd be really interested to know what changed in your view of leadership, kind of from when you first started in the Air Force to the end of your career?
Yeah, great question. I think that places like the Air Force Academy are a really good place to build a solid foundation, right? You learn the basics, but
Yep.
At 21, 22 years old, you don't know a lot, and you've got a solid foundation that you can build a house on, right? And then you spend the next part of your life building that house, which is what I did over 29 years of active duty service. But I think the biggest difference between sort of now and then is today I know what I don't know. And I think that is something when you're first starting out that's difficult to do, right? You know a lot because you've spent 4 years having your brain filled with information. Particularly at a place like the Air Force Academy, I mean, you've been told, for 4 years that you're elite, that you're smart, that you're exceptional, and so you come out thinking maybe that you know more than you do, and not really understanding sort of what those blind spots are. And I think as you take a few revolutions around the sun and live some life experiences, one of the things you learn is that you don't know what you don't know. And that that, right? So and I think from a leadership perspective, that gives you a different lens to look at things through, right? You understand, you may not know where they are, but you understand that you have blind spots. And as you mature as a leader, you learn a little bit about, okay, how do I discern what those blind spots are? And who can I talk to and ask that will point those out to me? And then what to do about that in a given leadership situation is realizing you don't have all the answers, that you may have blind spots, and I think that gives you a better perspective on how to approach a problem.
Yeah, it's almost like developing a humility as you go across it. As you're talking, it just reminded me. I remember very early on as a pilot, I was told the most dangerous pilots are ones with 1,500 flying hours, because they've seen enough to think they've seen it all, but they really haven't had anything crazy happen yet. And that it's somewhere around there where something throws them at them, and all of a sudden you kind of get shook with this, like it's never safe. It's never all okay. That's interesting. That's one of the biggest things you learn. Any particular, I don't know, if you were to go back in time and think and talk to yourself early on, like what would be some of the biggest, I don't know, almost blind spots, or what are the revelations that are there any big ones that came up to you?
Nothing specific comes to mind right now, but I remember, when I was younger, situations where I felt like I knew the answer, um,
Mm-hmm.
and so confident that I didn't go
Mm,
seek out different
okay.
opinions, different perspectives, maybe from people that had been around a lot longer, who had more experience with that particular problem. And I think, that's human nature, right? Particularly when you've got recency to a
Yeah.
situation, right? You've just been learning about something, and so you feel like you really understand it. And there are people that have you know been around the sun a few more times than you and have lived life experiences and might have a different perspective. And I was reticent to go seek those out. And again, back to your point on humility, I mean, pride is and ego is probably part of that, right? And
Yeah.
learning to put the ego in its place, I think, is also an important leadership lesson.
Yeah, I mean, I always do think, I think for a lot of new managers, when I think about myself at least, one of the biggest kind of shifts in mindset I had to have is that you think early on as a leader, you think that being a leader means you have the answers. At least that's how
Yeah.
I thought of it.
Or there's
And
an
it really has
expectation that you
nothing to
have
do
the
with that.
answers, right? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. And so changing that mindset of I don't I'm not here to have the answers. I'm here to create the situation where the answers can be found.
Yeah.
I think is one of the biggest mindset shifts that I had to make.
Yeah. I think that's a great
Um,
point.
yeah. And speaking of finding those best answers, one of the things that I always enjoyed after coming into your organization at SSC and kind of seeing you speak on social media, you've been one of the more I would say active critical voices within the military of upper level leadership in the military, especially coming into SSC. I came in about 4 years ago, and there was this big the Space Force was standing up,
Hmm.
there was all this change in the air, all these things. And I got the sense from people like yourself and other senior leaders that just this was a time of change. Like we needed to change. And I think a lot of what you were talking about was how like that change wasn't happening fast enough, or wasn't. What were some of the things that you saw that, or what is it that makes it so hard for organizations, large organizations, to change when everybody's saying, all the senior leaders are saying they need to change, but it seems like it's still not happening? What causes that, you think?
Yeah, we could spend all day talking about that.
Yeah.
And there's a lot to unpack there. Um, Let me start with I'll make a book recommendation. I'm a big reader, and,
Okay.
and often will refer to books that have been influential to me. And one of those is Essence of Decision by Graham Allison and I think it's Phil Zelikow. It's a book that's ostensibly about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it's an excellent read. I highly recommend it. But really, it's a book about how humans make decisions. And in
Okay.
the book, the authors present three different models for understanding sort of how humans make decisions, and they examine the Cuban Missile Crisis through the lenses of these three different models. And something I've done a lot of modeling and simulation in my career, and one of the things that people will say about models is that all models are wrong and some models are useful. And I think the same applies here,
Yes.
right? So the idea is not that you're supposed to choose between these three models, which one's most correct, but that there are three different lenses that can help you understand why did certain things happen the way that they happened, and how did people arrive at the decisions that they made. And so
Okay.
one of those models is the organizational behavior model that they look at. And I think that has been the most useful to me as far as understanding large bureaucratic organizations. And they're really focused on sort of government organizations. How does a government make decisions? And
Okay.
so what you have to understand about organizations is that, particularly in the large bureaucracy, is that those organizations are set up and optimized to do a specific thing, to achieve some kind of outcome. And what that means is that inside the organization, you get all these behaviors that are incentivized or disincentivized, as it may be, to help the organization achieve that outcome. Um, and those things get ingrained. They get ingrained in the processes and the procedures and the
Mm,
steps that you have to go through to get something done. And so when you're talking about organizational change, you've got to change all of that sort of baked in DNA that the
mm-hmm.
organization has spent, in some cases, decades
Yeah.
optimizing itself for. And so you can have a lot of people at multiple levels of the organization saying we have to do something different. But
Yeah.
if the entire organization itself is still sort of optimized for the old behavior, that's what you're going to get. Um, and so it's really hard, and you have to understand that. And I think sometimes we'll hear leaders talk about the frozen middle, right? You have
Yep.
leadership saying, "Hey, we have to change." You've got young, energetic,
They want to
new
go do
employees that
it.
want to go
Yeah.
do it, and then you have these crusty old people in the middle that we refer to the frozen middle. I don't like that because I
Okay.
think it's disparaging about a lot of those people, and I think that a lot of those
Yeah.
people that we would consider in the frozen middle, they're not trying to do a bad job. They're
Yeah.
not trying necessarily to resist change for the sake of resisting change. They're trying to operate within the incentive structures of the organization that and sort of practice those behaviors that they've been taught to practice. And you have to change that. And it's really hard. And you have to change it at multiple places in the organization. If you think about, a complex organization like Space Systems Command that we were in and thinking through, we want to change how we do acquisition. The number of different steps in that process. There's a requirements piece. There's sort of the planning piece of how are you going to, and the strategy piece, the contracts piece, the security piece, the finance piece, right? Like, and all of those are sort of bureaucracies within the bureaucracy, and they all have their own incentive structures. And if one of those is not aligned, then it doesn't matter how good of a job you do on the other side, on the other pieces of the organization, you're still not going to achieve the outcome that you want. And so you have to look at it really as a system, and that so that resonates with me as an lifelong engineer and trying
Yeah.
to look at things as systems of systems and what are the inputs to the system, what are the outputs, what are the behaviors that are baked in, and then figure out, okay, how do we change those behaviors?
Well, and I think you highlight the point of why it's so difficult, because I would imagine very often those kind of behaviors and those systems, it's like with culture where you say, you can't see it. It's like the water you're swimming in. And so many of these decisions, uh, many of these pieces of the culture of what's incentivized or how decisions are made, they're probably so baked in that they almost become invisible, especially if you've been there for a little while. You almost don't even know how to question them. They're not something that you think to question when you think of things to change. They seem kind of almost too fundamental to even realize they're there. Does that
Yeah,
sound right?
yeah, it's hard to figure out like what those behaviors are, what those incentive structures are, and they may not
Yeah.
be obvious, like you said.
Yeah.
You may really have to dig in and spend a lot of time unpacking it. One of the sort of personal challenges I took on at SSC while I was there was working on security.
Okay.
We execute a lot of classified programs,
Yeah.
and the classification always complicates things. It makes everything harder. You have to have the right environments, the right computers, the right networks, the right paperwork, the right clearances, all of that.
Yeah.
And that became a real barrier to executing programs. We were literally falling behind schedule and losing money because we couldn't do some of the basic security blocking and tackling. And so
Mm.
I spent quite a bit of time working with the security team and with others, just really trying to map out the entire process and understand every step of the process, why it was the way it was, who had the responsibility and the authority to to execute that step, who had the authority to change the step, right?
Yeah.
And we went through and we made some significant improvements. I won't claim that it's perfect now. It's still there's
Yeah.
it's just a hard area, but we made a lot of improvements. But as an example, one of the things we found is there was a person who was doing something, one way, and that was slowing things down. And when we went and asked, okay, finally found that person, right? Finding that person is hard. In fact, that step in the
Yeah.
process. Well, why, right? Why are you doing this? Do you understand like what the organization's trying to do? And they pointed to a Air Force instruction that said they had to do it that way. So I said, okay, well, who can waive that? Well, turns out it was the Undersecretary of the Air Force. So I got on an airplane and I went to Washington, D.C., and I
Oh,
met
I
with
love
him.
it.
And I came back with a guidance memo, which is sort of like a temporary change to the AFI. And I said, look, I changed it. You can go do that. We can fix that step now, right? And
Yeah.
if you think about a big bureaucracy, how many of those things are out there, right? Where a person
Yeah.
may want to do the right thing, but they feel constrained. Can you figure out where those constraints are? Can you figure out how to eliminate that constraint so that the person feels empowered to actually, try the new behavior? And
Yeah.
you have to do that at a human level, a personal level. I mean, that takes leadership and human contact to do it over and over. It's not enough to write a memo that says this is how we're going to do it, right?
Yeah. You're the thing that's coming to my mind is something that had constantly came to my mind when I was in the Air Force. Honestly, when I was at SpaceX, I think in so many large organizations, is this I would always run into these things where I felt like the majority of problems were either it was like they were above the authority of the people that it really impacted, but below the level of caring of the people who
Yeah.
could make a difference. Like in your case of needing the Undersecretary of Defense of the Air Force to change this AFI or to waive this AFI. And I think the thing that I love about the story that you just told is I recently listened to, I believe it was an interview with Mark Andreessen, where he was asked why is Elon so effective, or why are Elon companies so effective? And then the thing that Andreessen said was the company, all of Elon's companies have at any given time, they know like what's the critical path for the company in that week, like what's the blocker that's keeping the company from moving forward. And for that week, Elon makes it his mission to remove that blocker. And so to kind of go back to your story, it's the equivalent of this dramatically too high level person just systematically going through something that is kind of at an action level affecting people 12 levels
Yeah.
below them and just saying, I'm going to fix it, I'm going to fix it, I'm going to fix it. And the story that you just outlined, the reason why I love it so much is because you kind of gave a roadmap in some ways, or at least a plan of action for any leader in an organization who finds themselves in this place where I don't have the authority to fix this. I need somebody way above me. And honestly, it's just a matter of, it sounds like taking the time to map it out and create the story of why this is critical, right?
Yeah.
Like you spent the time. What was I'd love to kind of spend another moment kind of on that story of what was that process like of, and maybe if you want to use another example, feel free, but what's that process like of figuring out what are the limiting factors, spending all the time to kind of dig down and find the thing that if we can get the right person to action on this, it will have an outsized impact on the organization.
Yeah. I think particularly for a complex problem in a big bureaucracy, like a government organization, like the Space Systems Command, uh, you know, as I mentioned, there's a lot of these different sort of sub bureaucracies, and so the
Yeah.
problem is going to go across, sort of cross cut those, and it may the blockers may exist in one or more of those areas, and you don't know that without um, actually like mapping it out. You may have a sort of a sense of it, right? And the people that are
Yeah.
sort of having day-to-day contact with the problem are going to know, yeah, the blocker's here. This step takes too long. Um,
Yeah.
but that step may not, in the case like this example we just talked about, it may not take too long, um, because of that step. It may take too long because of some outside reason, some other reason. You have to map it out. And so really it's really just sort of a value stream mapping of understanding like what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and then trace it through step by step. And the way I did it in this example was I did a handful of offsites where I had to get everybody together, and getting the right people that really understand the steps is hard because everybody's busy, and you just have to block time to say, look, this, and in that particular case, I was able to quantify in terms of dollars that the organization was losing, literally millions of dollars a year, and and that took work too, like getting people to care is step one, right? So I had to be able to come up with the story for why does it matter. And so that mapped out, okay, I was able to show this is how many millions of dollars a year our organization is either losing or leaving on the table because we can't execute this process. And then so that is enough to get people to care. You get them all in a room, and then we literally just go through step by step. Well, what happens here? Who does that? Okay, and then why do you do that? And and then I'm sure the why story, right? You have to ask why 5 times to get to the actual root cause, right? Because this Air Force instruction says I have to do it this way, right? You have to get to that level, and that takes a long time. It takes hours, and you just have to map out those processes. So I don't think there's not an easy answer to it other than trying to really dig in and understand the problem, and then be able to take that to somebody that can actually change it. And once you get there, right, like, and part of the problem is that person who can change it is so high up in the organization, they're not aware of this, right? And nobody wants to bother them with this, right? So it's got to get to the point where the impact is so great and the story is so compelling that I can walk into that person's office in the Pentagon and say, you probably don't know this, but you're causing X action, and all I need you to do to fix it is sign this memo, right? And that was a no-brainer, right? That literally took, okay, I'll sign that, right? That makes perfect sense. Why didn't you tell me this sooner, right? So, but it just takes work of mapping it out and understanding it.
I think, and you're right. I don't think there's no easy way to do it, but it's just taking the time to care. And I'm guessing whether it's in this situation or other situations, there were many times where you started a meeting or started a conversation and quickly got to the point where, oh wait, we need this other person because there's this whole trail that the people in the room right now don't know the answer to. And so, okay, we'll bring this other person in. I imagine there's a lot of false starts as you go
there
along.
are, and so that process doesn't scale really well, right? And so that's one of the challenges. Back to your original question, how do you change a large organization? It takes a lot of these sort of contacts with the process, with the people who are executing the process, with the organization, to make these small changes which can have add up to a much larger outcome, right? But if you don't do some of that basic, just sort of the footwork of understanding the problems, understanding the incentives, understanding the why, you can have great slogans and pep rallies and all calls and a marketing blitz all day long, and you're going to get the same output.
I'm reminded of a story from the founding of Airbnb that I always hear, where it was like they were struggling to get traction and get movement and to get people into the system. And the way they made a plan, the founders made a plan of, we're going to go in and we're going to we're going to identify, the top 20 most used places, and we're going to go stay with the hosts and take pictures and give this really over the top experience for all of the top people. And a lot of the people who were funding them said, whoa, that's not scalable. And kind of the outcome of the whole thing was this idea of in order to scale, you have to do the unscalable. In order to get close enough to the problem, in order to really understand the root of the situation or what's going on, you kind of have to commit yourself to doing unscalable things at least for a time, or else you're just not going to understand the situation enough. And it sounds like that's kind of what what
Yeah.
you experienced if you just had to dive right in.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a great comparison. You have to be able to do those things that don't scale. You have to be willing to do those things that don't scale in order to get the organization moving in the right direction.
Yeah. I'd be interested, since you were kind of such a vocal leader on this front. Clearly, you're willing to get on a plane to go, get a signature to wave an AFI. Did you ever see that at the people below you? Did you have people coming to you from, because there's so many different levels at which this could happen. You needed to go get someone else's approval. There's some other problem that you could probably approve, but you weren't aware of it because it was so far below you. Did you ever experience people coming to you with similar kind of asks, or were you able to ever kind of empower that level of change in an organization?
Yeah, inside my own organization, yes, I think I did was able to do that, but it took time. And
Yeah.
what you have to establish with the team that you're leading is trust, and they
Okay.
have to
Yeah.
believe that you care and that you're going to do something about it, right? And
Mm.
if people um, will aren't willing to bring you problems, uh, then they're not going to because they don't believe that you're going to do anything about it.
Hmm.
They're going to stop coming to you with problems, right? And I think so.
Mm-hmm.
People have to see you actually execute that. And then
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you're not going to be able to. I don't have the authority to do that, or I
Mm-hmm.
went and asked the person that
Mm-hmm.
had the authority and they said no, and you have to be able to
Mm-hmm.
communicate that back.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I found um, really helpful as a leader is I had a suggestion box program. And so a lot of people, leadership, um, classes and whatnot, I've been sort of some of the leadership training I've been through is like never put out a suggestion box. Because the problem with suggestion box is people put their suggestion in and then nothing ever happens, right? And so
Yeah.
then they get
Yeah.
tired of, they stop giving suggestions.
Yeah.
I felt, ours was fairly successful. And the reason is I personally read every single one of them, and I
Mm-hmm.
gave a response, and it was anonymous, and then gave a response back to the entire organization at a regular cadence. Here's the suggestions we have. Here's the ones we have implemented already. Here's the ones we're looking into and why, and then sort of what the next steps are. And here's the ones we can't do and why. And we did
Yeah.
that very regularly, and I found that that was very effective. And after doing that for about a year, I had people coming out of the woodwork, sometimes through a suggestion box, but sometimes just walking into my office of saying, I see this problem, I need your help to fix it. And again, back to establishing trust. I think that the way that we were able to use that suggestion box, that everybody felt that their voice was heard, and we were able to actually show some positive action. We changed some policies. We changed quite a few things in our organization based on that. And it sometimes it was a very minor thing, and for all
Yeah.
I know, it was one person in the organization who had this problem. But because it was anonymous and the whole organization saw, we did everything in public. That the leadership was willing to listen and try to fix things and try to actually take action. Then people started coming with much bigger problems, right? And
Yeah.
outside the suggestion box because we'd established that level of trust.
I'm interested in this suggestion box idea. So was it just open, or did you open it at particular periods of time? Was it just kind of there that people could drop in at
It
any
was
time?
just there. Anybody could drop
Okay.
stuff in. It was a physical
Okay.
suggestion box. This was pre-COVID.
Oh.
We tried
Okay.
a digital suggestion box, sort of during and after the COVID times, and it was not quite as successful. So you
Okay.
you literally had to go drop a piece of paper into the box. It was a locked box
Yeah.
with a slot in the top. Your classic insert suggestion here.
Yeah.
Um, and it wasn't regularly, about once a month, every 3 or 4 weeks, I'd open it up. Sometimes there was nothing, and sometimes there was a lot.
Okay.
Sometimes it was I hate the music in the hallways, like things like that. because
Yeah.
we were inside a secure facility, and we had sort of background music going to
Yeah.
mask the sound, right? And there, I mean, it was everything, and some of it was like really
Yeah.
big, like there's fraud, waste, and abuse happening here. Like, okay,
Yeah.
let's take a look at that. So,
Yeah.
but be, but every single one of those, like replied all to the entire organization and
I love it.
said, this is what somebody brought to us.
Yep.
Here's the problem. Here, we've looked into it. We've fixed this, or we can't fix this. And but it was, again, people have to get feedback, and they have to see change. And
Yeah.
sometimes that meant we changed some really, so Rhett's opinion, some kind of silly stuff. Like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, the music one, that was a real, like, we had a couple people like, I don't like the music. So we said, okay, we're going to mix up the music. On Tuesdays, we're going to do this. On Wednesdays, we're going to do something different, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Does it matter? Like, it's background music in the hallway. Does it really matter?
Matters to
But
somebody.
it matters to somebody, right? But
Yeah.
what the message that sent for the organization was, hey, the leadership team is willing to take action and
Yeah.
change things, right?
Yeah.
And so you start small, and people will bring you bigger things.
Yeah. How big was your organization at that time in terms of number of people? About, like, we're talking a
We're
couple
about
hundred.
700 people, so
Okay.
yeah,
Okay. And so and then you're answering every couple of weeks. Sometimes there's nothing. Sometimes there's a bunch. So just a sense, because I think a lot of this comes back to that sense of scale. Of some organizations will not do that, or some leaders will
yeah,
not do that for fear of, oh, what if I create this unsustainable thing? And sometimes you just have
yeah,
to try it and
yeah.
see and be open to that. I imagine there's a little bit of opportunity since you were doing the reply alls. That also, signals to me an amazing opportunity to kind of better inform the population as well of what's in your
Hmm.
purview, what's not in your purview, what you think is a critical thing versus what you might think is maybe not as critical. You can kind of gently nudge that information out there as well. If people are continuing to come to you with things that you clearly can't control, it also helps narrow their focus in as well over time, I would imagine.
Yeah, and there were a lot of things that were suggested that we just couldn't implement for various. It was
Yeah.
against the law,
Yeah.
or it was there were good reasons we couldn't do it.
Yeah.
But I think that sort of through that reply all of being able to have a conversation with people and at least explain why. And
Mm-hmm.
a surprising number of people responded to those messages, right? So then that
Mm-hmm.
opened up sort of direct dialogue with the leadership, with people sort of 3 or 4 levels down in the organization. Now, back to
Yeah.
scale, at some point, sort of some size organization that doesn't scale. The
Yeah.
CEO doesn't have time, to respond back to every email from an employee. But
Yeah.
you can implement this sort of at different levels. This kind of just sort of transparency of here's what
Yeah.
we're doing and here's why. Here's what we
Yeah.
can't do and here's why. Great
Yeah.
idea. We don't
Yeah.
have the authority, but I'm going to go get that AFI changed, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And as much as I sometimes don't like the anonymous approach, and again, back to your level of, back to your idea of trust, every organization is going to be different of how willing people are also to raise their hand to ask the dumb question or say the dumb, some people are scared, some people are more nervous. And so, especially early on, I would venture to guess that anonymity it makes it much more willing that people in any organization, even if you don't have trust yet, are going to be willing to step forward, which seems
Yeah.
like it would be really
And if
helpful
you have
as well.
true anonymity, I think it does help. And that's one nice thing about the paper suggestion box, right? It was you just
Yeah. Yeah.
drop a piece of paper in, and I think even when you have an electronic suggestion box or something like this, even if you say it's anonymous, everybody assumes it's not. You logged my
Ah,
IP address, you know who I am, you like, right?
sure.
And that changes it somewhat. And so that may not,
Yeah.
in an organization that's distributed or, is, remote work or those kind of like that may not work.
Yeah.
You may need something else.
I'm seeing a world where a company that's distributed, because I work with a few organizations that are truly distributed, and I can see, to your point, like, one, I can see, people aren't really believing that it's anonymous. Two, I think friction is good
Yeah.
in some circumstances, a little bit of friction. And so I can imagine a world where a distributed organization just gives every employee like a postage or a prepaid like postage card, that they can just fill out and just drop, to make it so it's still paper, something like that. Although again, then that's going to get stamped, so maybe it's not fully anonymous.
Hey, I only have one employee in Huntsville, and he's very disgruntled.
Yeah. That's tricky.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I mean, when we started this, before we started recording, and I said I kind of wanted to focus on this idea of change in large organizations, and you were kind of like, I don't know if we're going to have any good answers. I think you've provided a couple really, really good suggestions, all centered on this idea, especially in large organizations. I think we get obsessed with this idea of scale. We get obsessed with this idea. I mean, I know I totally fell into this as a learning leader at SpaceX and at other large organizations. To me, I was always just like, if this isn't going to work for all 7,000 people, then I don't want to hear it. That's honestly how my mindset was a lot of the time. And I think you have provided, both for me and certainly for me, hopefully for the listeners, a couple really great frameworks for how to start doing some unscalable things, but that are worth doing anyway, because it's the only way you can unlock the potential of some of these large organizations and kind of stop that bottleneck.
Yeah, I agree.
Awesome. Well, this has been great. I really thank you for your time. Like I said, I think that there are a few nuggets in there that I'm going to be thinking about for a while, especially this idea of just like unscalable approaches to effective leadership. I think that's really great. So thank you so much for your time today. Thank you. It's been great.
Great. Thanks, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to today's show. If you are looking for help turning your organization's great engineers into great managers, me and my team at Better Everyday Studios would love to help. We deliver targeted and interactive training workshops that are designed to help build the 3 fundamental skills of any new manager: building trust, giving feedback, and setting goals. Reach out to me through matt@bettereverydaystudios.com so we can start making your organization better every day.